Sometimes religious people act like they have very little in common with irreligious people. But the truth is, we all have more in common than we don't because we're all dealing with life. And it doesn't matter if you're a Jesus follower or not. Life can be complicated, challenging, and painful at times, can't it? Some of you just came out of a season where it was all of this and maybe more. And some of you are in a season like that right now and you're not sure you're going to get out of it. And unfortunately, if you don't fall into one of the first two groups, you're probably about to go into a season like this because that's just how life seems to work. Now, before you start thinking you know where I'm going with the conversation today, let me assure you, we're not going to end up where you might assume. This is Journey at Home. My name is Jarrod, and we don't do cute answers or try to gloss over the tough stuff we all deal with every day. This channel is a weekly exploration of how practical following Jesus looks in everyday life, how he makes life better, and how he makes us better at living a full life. So like, subscribe, get notifications, because where we're going today will be something you can take and practice today. Because we all face these seasons of hard life, of challenge, complicated stuff, painful stuff. And we all have something else in common too. What do you want most when you're in a complicated, challenging, and painful season of life? You want what I want. You want relief. You want the problems to be solved and the pain to go away. And if life gets hard enough and things get tough enough, we'll become less rational and more reactionary and do about anything to find relief. And I hope you get that relief. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. Instead, I want to spend the next few minutes answering this question. What if relief doesn't come? Because it doesn't show up sometimes, does it? Relief isn't guaranteed. What if things never get better? What if that thing you hope changes never changes? What if you do all the right things and you still lose? If that's your reality, where is God in the middle of that? And is there any conceivable way that he's got a place for you in his story with all that you're going through? So for those of you just joining us, this is week 5 of our series, The Acts of Us, Making the Next Chapter Ours, where we're exploring the history of the early church as told by Luke in the New Testament document we call Acts. But we're exploring it to discover the clues that show us the plan and place God has for us in his story. Because the book of Acts not finished. The story's not over that he's writing, and he intends for the next chapter to be ours. It's a story where we partner with God to be witnesses of what God is doing and has done in our lives. It's a story where we surrender to God and trust him enough to make ourselves willing and available for whatever he wants to do in our lives. It's a story where he takes ordinary people like us and does extraordinary things in and through us together. But it's not a story that guarantees everything's going to end up perfectly for any of us. So what do you do when life doesn't work out like you want it to? Well, when you read the history of the early Jesus followers, you find they were in this position more times than not. Their lives were a series of good and bad, ups and downs, highs and lows that they seemed to experience over and over at the same time. You might expect God to bless them with easy lives or good things, and maybe a little extra beach time on the Sea of Galilee for all the hard work they were doing to spread the message of Jesus. But it didn't exactly work out that way. They faced opposition from Roman authorities because their message about Jesus, whom they called a king, threatened Caesar. And in addition to that, they faced opposition from the Jewish authorities because their message of a new way of living threatened the entire Jewish religious system. And as we saw last week, they even had some issues within the church. But what they'd experienced up to this point only intensified. We left off last week with leaders of the church inviting several people into new roles to help the movement move forward, right? One of them was a man named Stephen. Stephen was highly respected in the early church and was on the front lines as the church grew up rapidly. But unfortunately for Stephen, the Jewish leaders who had Jesus killed weren't too happy about how much the church was growing. So they do to Stephen exactly what they did to Jesus. They arrest him and then bring him to trial in front of the Sanhedrin where he is interrogated by the same people who arrested, interrogated, and executed Jesus. Think about how that must have felt. Stephen knows who these Jewish leaders are, and he knows what they've just done to Jesus not too long ago, so he knows what they can do and may do to him. And then finally, they give him a moment of the trial to speak in his own defense, and he has a choice in this moment. The easy route is to take the road of self-preservation and say, I like Jesus, but I love you guys. Thanks for all you do for our country. But Stephen doesn't take that road at all. Instead, he gives this speech where he reminds them of all that God's done in their history. And then with unbelievable boldness and courage, he points his finger at these powerful religious leaders and says this, You stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. And by the way, that was a big first-time century Jewish insult, right? He says, you are just like your ancestors. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And now you have betrayed and murdered him. You have received the law that has given through angels, but have not obeyed it. Stephen's like, you guys are the pros. You should have known better. You had everything at your fingertips to recognize who Jesus was, and you totally missed it. You decided to kill God in human flesh, the one who'd been waiting centuries to show up. You just didn't cooperate with God in the story he's telling, no matter what he does for you. Now, you might assume that God's going to reward Stephen for all that courage and faith, but that's not what happens. Here's what the story says. At this, they covered their ears, and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. So let me ask you a question. We've all wondered about this at times. God, where are you? And why would you let that happen to Stephen? I mean, he's a good guy doing good things for you, and just when he needs your help the most, you don't help him? Apparently not. But don't miss how Stephen responds. He isn't counting on God rescuing him. Luke tells us, while they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And then he fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. When he had said this, he fell asleep. He died. There was no comeback. There was no miracle. There were no answered prayers. Stephen had lived a life that fully honored God. He had served and loved people just like Jesus. He'd played the part God gave him in the bigger story, and God still didn't do what we think makes sense and save Stephen's life. I mean, what do we do with that? What do we do when we lose? How do you make sense of the moments when God doesn't come through for you? Does it mean God doesn't care for you? Does it mean he's not there? Does it mean he's not at work in the situation, or he's just abandoned you? For these first century Christians we just read about, those were the questions that rattled around in their minds, because the murder of Stephen triggered a season of suffering for all of them. Here's what Luke writes about next. And Saul approved of their killing him. And that day a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. I mean, this sounds horrible, doesn't it? Most of these Jesus followers had to leave their homes and run for their lives. Their worlds were turned upside down. How could that be a part of what God was doing in the world? But you know what? God is masterful at writing complicated seasons and challenging circumstances into his story and then using it for good. He can always bring purpose from the pain. And that's what he did in this moment. While fleeing Jerusalem felt like a loss, guess what happened? Everywhere they fled, they took the message of Jesus with them. If this hadn't happened, the message would have taken a lot longer to get out of Jerusalem. And that would have been a problem. Remember what Jesus told them just before he left earth. In Acts 1:8, he clearly said, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and in Samaria and to the ends of the earth. But it's been 2 to 3 years since Jesus told them to get going, and nobody's left Jerusalem. They were content to stay where they were comfortable, so God used something nobody would have wished for to do something that everybody hoped for. He used a terrible persecution to help spread the message of his love to people in nearby regions who had never heard of his death and resurrection. He also used it to recruit the last person you'd ever expect to partner with him in his story. But hey, more on that next week. This week, I just want to remind all of us who are dealing with complicated, challenging, painful seasons of life that your circumstances don't negate your place in God's story. It actually does the opposite. God's story brings purpose from your pain. He didn't cause the pain, but he is a master storyteller, and he can bring good from it. Your pain isn't pointless. It's not random. It's not senseless or meaningless. If you will choose to partner with God and what he's wanting to do in and through you, he will redeem your pain and bring something greater out of it. And isn't that what you ultimately want? I know you want relief when hard things hit. So do I. But what we want more is to know that our pain isn't wasted, to know that our suffering has meaning, to know that the challenges made us and the people around us better, to see purpose in the pain that can happen if you'll surrender to God and His story in the middle of your pain. It's one of the boldest, most courageous things you can do. It's also one of the most powerful. So if you're coming out of a painful season, I want to invite you to pause and look back for the good that God's bringing out of it now. Pause and recognize the purpose He's brought from your pain. And if you're currently in a season of struggle, I want to invite you to pray a very courageous prayer where you invite Him to make this season part of His story for you and those around you. Would you just tell God this? Father, use this season for your story. Bring purpose from my pain. God, I don't like this season. I hope you'll remove it, but most of all, please use it. I'm surrendering it to you and trusting you to bring good from it. Now imagine for a moment what might happen if you opened yourself up to let God use you and your pain. You're surrounded by people who will be more impacted by your response to your pain than you ever know. Just like the pain of persecution led to thousands of people throughout Judea and Samaria following Jesus, He'll use your pain to change you and those around you for the better.